moment after Mr. and Mrs. Darling left the house, the night lights by the beds of the three children continued to burn clearly.
They were awfully nice little night lights, and one cannot help wishing that they could have kept awake to see Peter.
But Wendy's light blinked and gave such a yawn that the other two yawned also.
And before they could close their mouths, all the three went out.
There was another light in the room now, 1,000 times brighter than the night lights.
And in the time we have taken to say this, it had been in all the drawers in the nursery.
Looking for Peter's shadow,
Rummaged the wardrobe and turned every pocket inside out.
it was not really a light.
It made this light by flashing about so quickly.
But when it came to rest for a second, you saw it was a fairy.
No longer than your hand, but still growing.
It was a girl called Tinker Bell, exquisitely gowned in a skeleton leaf, cut low and square, through which her figure could be seen to the best advantage.
A moment after the fairy's entrance, the window was blown open by the breathing of the little stars.
And
Peter dropped in.
he had carried Tinker Bell part of the way, and his hand was still messy with fairy dust.
Tinker Bell?
He called softly, after making sure that the children were asleep.
Tink, where are you?
She was in the jug for the moment and liking it extremely. She had never been in a jug before.
Oh, do come out of that jug. And tell me, do you know where they put my shadow?
The loveliest tinkle, as of golden bells, answered him.
It is the fairy language.
You ordinary children can never hear it. But if you were to hear it, you would know that you had heard it once before.
Tink said that the shadow was in the big box.
She meant the chest of drawers.
And Peter jumped at the drawers, scattering their contents on the floor with both hands.
In a moment he had recovered his shadow, and in his delight he forgot that he had shut Tinker Bell up in the drawer.
If he ever thought at all.
But we don't believe he ever thought.
It was that he and his shadow, when brought near each other, would join like drops of water.
And when they did not, he was appalled.
He tried to stick it on with soap from the bathroom, but that also failed.
A shudder passed through Peter.
And he sat on the floor and cried.
His sobs woke Wendy, and she sat up in bed.
She was not alarmed to see a stranger crying on the nursery floor. She was only pleasantly interested.
Boy, why are you crying?
Peter rose and bowed to her beautifully.
She was much pleased and bowed beautifully to him from the bed.
What's your name?
Wendy Moira Angela Darling. What's your name?
Peter Pan.
She was already sure that he must be Peter, but it did seem a comparatively short name.
Is that all?
Yes.
I'm so sorry.
Doesn't matter.
She asked where he lived.
Second to the right and then straight on till morning.
What a funny address.
Peter had a sinking feeling. For the first time, he felt that perhaps it was a funny address.
No, it isn't.
I mean, is that what they put on the letters?
He wished that she had not mentioned letters.
Don't get any letters.
But your mother gets letters.
Don't have a mother.
Not only had he no mother, he had not the slightest desire to have one. He thought them very overrated persons. Wendy, however, felt at once she was in the presence of a tragedy.
Oh, Peter, no wonder you were crying.
I wasn't crying about mothers. I was crying because I can't get my shadow to stick on. Besides, I wasn't crying.
It's come off.
Yes.
Then Wendy saw the shadow on the floor, looking so draggled, and she was frightfully sorry for Peter.
How awful.
She could not help smiling when she saw that he'd been trying to stick it on with soap.
How exactly like a boy.
Fortunately, she knew at once what to do.
It must be sewn on.
What's sewn?
Dreadfully ignorant.
No, I'm not.
But she was exulting in his ignorance.
I shall sew it on for you, my little man. I dare say it will hurt a little.
Oh, I shan't cry.
Peter was already of the opinion that he had never cried in his life, and he clenched his teeth and did not cry. And soon his shadow was behaving properly, though still a little creased.
Perhaps I should have ironed it.
Peter, boy-like, was indifferent to appearance, and he was now jumping about in the wildest glee. Alas, he had already forgotten that he owed his bliss to Wendy. He thought he had attached the shadow himself.
How clever I am!
He crowed rapturously.
Oh, the cleverness of me!
It is humiliating to have to confess that this conceit of Peter was one of his most fascinating qualities. To put it with brutal frankness, there never was a cockier boy. But for the moment, Wendy was shocked.
Of course, I did nothing.
You did a little.
A little? Well, if I am of no use, I can at least withdraw.
She sprang in the most dignified way into bed and covered her face with the blanket.
To induce her to look up, he pretended to be going away, and when this failed, he sat on the end of the bed and tapped her gently with his foot.
Wendy, don't withdraw. I can't help crowing, Wendy, when I'm pleased with myself.
Still, she would not look up, though she was listening eagerly.
Wendy, one girl is more use than 20 boys.
She peeped out of the bedclothes.
Do you really think so, Peter?
Yes, I do.
I think it's perfectly sweet of you, and I'll get up again.
She also said she would give him a kiss if he liked, but Peter did not know what she meant, and he held out his hand expectantly.
Well, surely you know what a kiss is.
I shall know when you give it to me.
Not to hurt his feeling, she gave him a thimble.
So shall I give you a kiss?
If you please.
She made herself relatively cheap by inclining her face toward him, but he merely dropped an acorn button into her hand, so she slowly returned her face to where it had been before, and said nicely that she would wear his kiss on the chain around her neck.
It was lucky that she did put it on that chain, for it was afterwards to save her life.
Wendy, who always liked to do the correct thing, asked Peter how old he was.
I don't know, but I am quite young.
He really knew nothing about it. He merely had suspicions, but he said at a venture,
Wendy, I ran away the day I was born. It was because I heard Father and Mother talking about what I was to be when I became a man. I don't want ever to be a man. I want always to be a little boy and have fun. So I ran away to Kensington Gardens and lived a long, long time among the fairies.
She gave him a look of the most intense admiration, and he thought it was because he had run away, but it was really because he knew fairies.
You see, Wendy, when the first baby laughed for the first time, its laugh broke into 1,000 pieces, and they all went skipping about, and that was the beginning of fairies. And so there ought to be one fairy for every boy and girl.
Ought to be, isn't there?
No. You see, children know such a lot now. They soon don't believe in fairies, and every time a child says, I don't believe in fairies, there's a fairy somewhere that falls down dead.
Really, he thought they had talked enough about fairies. And it struck him that Tinker Bell was keeping very quiet.
I can't think where she's gone to.
He called Tink by name. Wendy's heart went flutter with a sudden thrill.
Peter, you don't mean to tell me that there's a fairy in this room?
Well, she was here just now. You don't hear her, do you?
The only sound I hear is a tinkle of bells.
Well, that's Tink. That's the fairy language. I think I can hear her too.
The sound came from the chest of drawers, and Peter made a merry face. No one could ever look quite so merry as Peter, and the loveliest of gurgles was his laugh. He had his first laugh still.
Wendy, I do believe I shut her up in the drawer.
He let poor Tink out of the drawer, and she flew about the nursery, screaming with fury.
You shouldn't say such things. Of course, I'm very sorry. But how could I know you were in the drawer?
Oh, Peter, if only she would stand still and let me see her.
Oh, they hardly ever stand still. Tink, this lady says that she wishes you were her fairy.
Tinkerbell answered insolently.
What does she say, Peter?
She's not very polite. She says you are a great, huge, ugly girl and that she is my fairy. You know you can't be my fairy, Tink, because I am a gentleman and you are a lady. She's quite a common fairy. She's called Tinkerbell because she mends the pots and kettles.
They were together in the armchair by this time, and Wendy plied him with more questions.
If you don't live in Kensington Gardens now...
Oh, sometimes I do.
But where do you live mostly now?
With the lost boys.
Oh, who are they?
They are the children who fall out of their perambulators when the nurse is looking the other way. If they're not claimed in 7 days, they are sent far away to the Neverland to defray expenses. I'm captain.
Oh, what fun it must be!
Yes, but we are rather lonely. You see, we have no female companionship.
Are none of the others girls?
Oh, no. Girls, you know, are much too clever to fall out of their pram.
This flattered Wendy immensely.
I think it's perfectly lovely the way you talk about girls. John there just despises us.
For reply, Peter rose and kicked John out of bed, blankets and all, one kick. This seemed to Wendy rather forward for a first meeting, and she told him with spirit that he was not captain in her house. However, John continued to sleep so placidly on the floor that she allowed him to remain there.
And I know you meant to be kind, so you may give me a kiss.
For the moment, she had forgotten his ignorance about kisses.
I thought you would want it back.
Oh dear, I don't mean a kiss. I mean a thimble.
What's that?
It's like this.
She kissed him.
Wendy screeched.
What is it, Wendy?
Oh, it's exactly as if someone were pulling my hair.
That must have been Tink. I never knew her so naughty before.
And indeed, Tink was darting about, using offensive language.
She says she will do that to you, Wendy, every time I give you a thimble.
Peter could not understand why, but Wendy understood, and she was just slightly disappointed when he admitted that he came to the nursery window, not to see her, but to listen to stories.
You see, I don't know any stories. None of the lost boys knows any stories.
How perfectly awful.
Do you know why swallows build in the eaves of houses? It is to listen to the stories. Oh, Wendy, your mother was telling you such a lovely story.
Which story was it?
About the prince who couldn't find the lady who wore the glass slipper.
Oh, Peter, that was Cinderella, and he found her, and they lived happily ever after.
Peter was so glad that he rose from the floor where they had been sitting and hurried to the window.
Well, where are you going?
Well, to tell the other boys.
Oh, don't go, Peter. I know such a lot of stories.
Those were her precise words.
So there can be no denying that it was she who first tempted him.
He came back.
and there was a greedy look in his eyes which ought to have alarmed her.
But did not.
Oh, the stories I could tell to the boys.
Then Peter gripped her and drew her toward the window.
Let me go.
Wendy, do come with me and tell the other boys.
Oh dear, I can't. Think of Mummy. Besides, I can't fly.
I'll teach you.
Oh, how lovely to fly. Of course, it's awfully fascinating. Peter, would you teach John and Michael to fly too?
If you like.
Wake up! Peter Pan has come and he's to teach us to fly.
John rubbed his eyes. Of course, he was on the floor already.
Michael was up by this time also, looking as sharp as a knife with 6 blades and a saw. But Peter suddenly signed silence.
Their faces assumed the awful craftiness of children listening for sounds from the grown-up world.
All was as still as salt.
Then everything was right.
No, stop!
Everything was wrong.
Nana, who had been barking distressfully all evening, was quiet now.
It was her silence they had heard.
And thus, when Lisa the cook entered, holding Nana, the nursery seemed quite its old self, very dark. And you could have sworn you heard its 3 wicked inmates breathing angelically as they slept.
They were really doing it artfully from behind the curtains.
Unfortunately, Lisa returned Nana outside, and Nana, seeing that no help would come from her, strained and strained at the chain until at last she broke it.
In another moment, she had burst into the dining room of 27 and flung up her paws to heaven, her most expressive way of making a communication.
Mr. and Mrs. Darling knew at once that something terrible was happening in their nursery, and without a goodbye to their hostess, they rushed into the street.
But it was now 10 minutes since 3 scoundrels had been breathing behind the curtains, and Peter Pan can do a great deal in 10 minutes.
It's all right.
John announced, emerging from his hiding place.
I say, Peter, can you really fly?
Instead of troubling to answer him, Peter flew round the room, taking the mantelpiece on the way.
I say, how do you do it?
You just think lovely, wonderful thoughts and they lift you up in the air.
None of them could fly an inch.
Of course, Peter had been trifling with them, for no one can fly unless the fairy dust has been blown on him. Fortunately, one of his hands was messy with it, and he blew some on each of them, with the most superb results.
Now, just wiggle your shoulders this way and let go.
They were all on their beds, and gallant Michael let go first.
He did not quite mean to let go, but he did it, and immediately he was borne across the room.
I flew!
He screamed while still in midair.
John let go and met Wendy near the bathroom.
Oh, lovely.
Ah, how ripping!
Look at me!
Oh, look at me.
Look at me! I say, why shouldn't we all go out?
Of course, it was to this that Peter had been luring them.
Michael was ready. He wanted to see how long it took him to do 1 billion miles.
But Wendy hesitated.
There are mermaids
Oh,
and there are pirates.
Pirates! Let us go at once.
Come!
Peter cried imperiously and soared out at once into the night, followed by John and Michael and Wendy.
Mr. and Mrs. Darling and Nana rushed into the nursery too late.
The birds were flown.